12:01, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time and go ahead and get started. My name is Paige Miller. I am a career consultant at the University of Alabama Career Center, and I work primarily with the College of Human Environmental Sciences, but in various capacities I work with all majors. We have two other career center staff that are going to be presenting today, so I wanted to allow them to go ahead and introduce themselves. Tiffany, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Tiffany Gooden. Thank you for being with us today. I am a career advisor and work primarily with the College of Nursing and the School of Social Work students.
Amy?
Yeah, I'm Amy Bramblett, and I am the manager of the Career Center Satellite Office over in the College of Communication and Information Sciences.
So we appreciate everyone joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about acing a virtual interview. So we know that times have changed a lot, and with the quarantining or social distancing, a lot of people are doing virtual interviews or may not be able to see you in person, at least for the first round of interviews. So this is our final career champion chat of the week. We may do some more in the future, but I wanted to let you know that we're going to start off by giving you a few tips, and then I will open it up by asking our panelists a couple of questions, but then we want you to be able to ask questions as well. So you can put a question, type a question in the chat, or you can feel free to ask it yourself on the Zoom. We want it to be interactive too, so that we can start to get to know you if we don't know you already. So either way you feel comfortable, you can share a question in the chat or speak up and share a question. And I will try to do my best to keep up with those questions if you put them in the chat so that you can ask them directly. So we wanted to start off and each give you one or two of our top tips for acing a virtual interview. Amy, do you have a tip that you would like to start off by sharing?
Yeah, sure, I'll start. So my tip is simply to be very intentional with your setup, making sure that you have a dedicated space where you can control most of the factors in the environment. You know, a barking dog will happen now and again, an interruption from a child that happens to me sometimes, but for the most part, you don't want to be nervous that you don't know what's going to go on. You want to control that the best you can, and this includes camera angle. Make yourself a studio, set it up, lighting, making sure that they can see you, that if you are doing an interview that you're wearing the appropriate clothes, which we're going to talk more about, but just making your space your studio is my top tip.
Thank you. Tiffany, what about you? You have a tip for our students?
Sure, I definitely agree with Amy. That's a big part of it, and that will help calm your nerves too. And that was my tip. Really applies to virtual interviews as well as any kind of interview, but especially virtual. If you feel nervous, part of the benefit of it being virtual is that you can just be at home or somewhere comfortable. That will help you as you prepare. And one thing that I have learned actually through the speaking center, the speaking studio at the University of Alabama, is that if you can kind of, before you start, do some deep breaths and do some even posture type of exercises. And this kind of looks silly and you feel silly, but again, you're at home, so you can do this. But if you can kind of make yourself big and put your arms up and uncross your legs and, you know, kind of take some deep breaths. And even they say taking a deep breath and exhaling really quickly can help calm your nerves. It sounds silly, but it has been proven to physiologically make you less stressed. So if you have that going on, plus you feel pretty confident with controlling your surroundings, kind of like what Amy was talking about with your settings, I think that will give you a big edge to be able to be in your comfort zone with your calming breath and your limited distractions, and hopefully that will give you a good starting point to then interact with the potential interview or the interviewers.
I think Tiffany and Amy both make great points, and that all has to do with prepping before an interview. So thinking about the things we need to do before the interview, we're often thinking of like our answers during an interview, but those are things that you need to prep before an interview. And I'll give a quick tip, and then I'll start by asking a couple of questions, and then I'll open it up to the participants to ask questions. And if everybody can make sure they're muted, that would be great, until they want to ask a question. So that would limit distractions. So my quick tip is about eye contact. So what I've discovered over this time of getting to use Zoom and Skype and all this is when you have somebody in front of you, physically, it's easy to make eye contact because they're sitting right there. But when you're looking at a computer, I tend to want to look at the picture of the person. But if you're really wanting to make eye contact, then you need to look in the camera. So my camera's right here, and so I have to, focus myself to think like, okay, when I'm wanting to speak to someone directly and make eye contact, I need to look at the camera and not look at their picture. And like a call like this, there's a lot of people on. So if I'm wanting to look at different people's faces, then my eyes maybe look like they're going different directions. So maintaining eye contact is my top tip. And hopefully you wouldn't have this many people on if you were interviewing, so it might be a little easier than that. So the next thing I'm going to do is I have a couple of questions I just want to start off the discussion with Amy and Tiffany to ask them their input on, and then I will open it up to questions from the participants as well. So Amy and Tiffany, or either one of you or both of you, whichever one wants to answer, what is the appropriate attire for a virtual interview? So if you're not going to be there in person, what should you wear?
I'll let you go for it.
Okay. So I think the idea is that even though it has to be virtual, you want to make it as realistic to a real typical interview as you can. So that's why, like we're talking about, even though it's awkward to look at the camera, do it anyway, because that makes it feel more like a natural in-person interview. Normally in a real regular interview, you would probably wear a suit to an interview. So that's what you want to do for this one too. So again, I mean, probably you won't have to stand up. So if you wanted to wear pajama bottoms and then just have your top in the suit, you could do that. However, you never know when you might have to get up and answer something, or that would just be a nightmare to me, as if I prepared to only be from here up and for some reason somebody needed me and I had to dart out and I'm wearing shorts or something, or house shoes or something like that. So I would say again, that would help you mentally feel prepared, knowing that if a distraction happens, you don't have to worry about that. But also, it really changes how you even feel while you're sitting there interviewing. If you can have on the full suit, even shoes if you want to, that just helps you feel more like it's a normal in-person regular interview. And I think that will probably come across in your demeanor. And of course, if y'all have questions about what does that look like, I mean, I'm just saying suit. And if you have specifics on like color and type and all that kind of stuff, of course we can answer that if you have them. But I was just thinking, sometimes people think it's a little better or okay to go more casual because it's virtual. In an interview, I probably wouldn't. I wouldn't recommend that unless they tell you ahead of time, hey, nobody's going to be wearing a suit. Please, like if they are insistent that you not wear one, you want to kind of take that into account. But I still wouldn't go super casual, even if they are, because they're not the ones being interviewed and you are. So because of that, you want to step it up a little bit.
I would add too, I've noticed this in particular because we've done quite a few mock interviews this summer. I've noticed that certain colors could be distracting in a virtual interview that aren't necessarily in person. It's something about the light and then the way that the camera takes the image in. So that, I think goes back to my first tip, which is sort of test out the space and look at the camera. What do you look like? What do your colors look like? And that kind of thing. And then I've also, and this is a delicate thing to say, but I've noticed that skin can be a little bit more pronounced on camera. Something that I'll just leave it at that. I would definitely look at the cut of your suit, of your shirt, and that kind of thing to make sure that everything looks just like you want it to.
Yeah. I think Tiffany and Amy both give great points. And even what I try to do and what I tell students to do is even practicing. So ask your friend can I Zoom call you to see how this looks?
Mhm.
So if the color is, coming across strange, or, something looks, strange about, the fit of it, and then you can hear from a friend before you get on with a professional. Or if the lighting's not good, I had the first ever Zoom call I did was a while back, when I was presenting to a class, and the lighting in the room I chose was not good. So I should have practiced. And then I'll add to that, I've also had students tell me that the interviewer asked them to stand up. So Tiffany's point about wearing the full suit, I have actually had students tell me that interviewers have asked them to stand up so they can see their professional attire. So that could happen too.
Wow.
So you never know. Okay, thank you, Amy and Tiffany. I'll do one more question, and then see if anybody has some, and if they don't, then we'll go forward with some more tips. Is it okay to use a phone? What kind of device should you use during a virtual interview on your end?
I think, well, a lot of us just have to use what we have, as we didn't have time to go out and shop before the pandemic happened. So I'll start with that, realizing that you only have the resources that you possess. And aside from that, I like using my laptop. There's more that I can control. It's a little bit more stable, but I was joking with y'all, and yesterday my internet connection just did not work. It's the first time I've had to do it, but I turned off the Wi-Fi, got on my cell phone, I propped it up so that it was a very nice stable picture, put it on some books, and the Zoom app on cell phone worked fantastically. So I will say you might want to have a backup technology in case that happens, but those are my preferences. What about you, Tiffany?
I have not done a Zoom call on my phone before, and I think that's smart to prop it so it's at least stable. My fear would be if I got an incoming call, like, how does it look, and what do I do? Like, do I flip out, trying to touch the screen, everybody's seeing that, or what? So I think I would definitely need to test it first to see how it works, and maybe stage that scenario so I can practice that. But I'm on a desktop now just because that's all I have besides my cell phone, and I was afraid of that happening. But I think, again, if you're going with what you have, and if you have some options, probably just whatever is the least likely to have distractions associated with it or around it is going to be your better option.
Right. So I would say with some of the interviews I've seen, is that people, what Amy said was really important. If you use a cell phone, prop it up on some books or something, that is stable, so that the camera's not moving around, and that you should be sitting with it propped up and not walking around holding your phone. So it's not like a call that, when you called your friend on FaceTime while you were shopping. It needs to be stable. And sitting up. I even had, I'm sharing some of the horror stories with you, so in hopes that you won't do that. I even had a student that appeared to be laying down and holding their phone up like this. So, I go back to what Amy and Tiffany said, whatever technology you have, you need to use, but, making sure that it's stable and propped so that the camera's not moving around. It was good. Well, those are a couple of questions, and I have some more that we can share with the folks, but I would really like to hear from some of the participants. Is there anybody that has a question about virtual interviewing that you either want to put in the chat? You can type it in the chat and I'll ask it of Tiffany or Amy, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question if you would like. If you do ask a question, if you do unmute yourself and ask your question, if you'll say your name and your major, and maybe your year, if you're a senior getting ready to graduate doing these virtual interviews, that would be great. I don't see anybody asking questions right now. Well, I'll go on with my next question, and feel free to put those in the chat, or when we finish up with one question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask those. What are some typical interview questions? I know this may be, it's not just virtual. That's not just virtual. So some typical interview questions that may be asked either virtual or in person?
So usually they're going to want you to kind of start out with most of the time they'll say, so tell us a little bit about yourself. And obviously they know a little bit about you, most likely because you have applied, you've probably sent a resume and a cover letter. Basically, you're just trying to summarize that. It's almost even kind of a courtesy way to let you kind of get started talking, but there may also be people on the interview or in the interview that have not reviewed those documents. So you want to be prepared with something to be able to, we call it like your elevator pitch, to talk a little bit about yourself. That's something that you can prepare ahead of time very easily. I mean, like it's doable. We can help you with it. It's not always super easy to kind of construct if you're new at that, but that's our job, is to help you know how to do that. But I would say be prepared with that, because most interviews will start with that kind of question. And generally the rest of the questions are going to be them asking you basically, what are your strengths? That's essentially what they're asking in different ways. What do you bring to the table? What are your strengths? And what's been your experience to kind of show those strengths? And the good thing is that you can see lots of sample interview questions on our website, in our career guide, if you have a physical copy, or it's also listed on our website, we can point you toward that. Also Pinterest, Google, anything. Like you could look up sample interview questions lots of places. And we could talk about like how to answer those. A lot of times you're going to get, if you've never done an interview before, you might be surprised that you'll see they're called behavior-based interview questions. So they're going to ask for examples of times that you've demonstrated different things, like give me an example of a time you've shown leadership skills. That's hard if you haven't practiced, because you have to remember stuff that you've done before in pretty good detail, and then also be able to answer it in a way that tells the whole story. So if you haven't had a mock interview, that's where that really becomes helpful, because it helps you formulate those answers, but also helps you practice delivering it.
Yeah, and I would add sort of your typical at the end questions as well. Something, it may be phrased differently, but something along the lines of, why should we hire you and not the other candidates? Or, what's your take on your best qualifications type of thing. But sort of a thing that would signal that this is one of the last chances you get to discuss your competitive advantage in this position. And what questions do you have is a pretty typical question. And they do expect you to ask questions. You do want to have some written down or in your mind that you have ready, that will tell them a lot about you as well. So those are should be practiced or thought of ahead of time, just as those ones Tiffany was discussing.
Great. Those are great. Great tips. And I want to reiterate what Amy and Tiffany both said, and say that the Career Center is here for services for you. So even though we're virtual, like today, we're doing this workshop today, you can make an appointment with us to do a mock interview. You can make an appointment with us just for interview tips. So if you're not ready even to do the mock interview and you want tips about the interview, you can make an appointment with us for that. And so we are happy, whether we're in person or virtual, to do those appointments with you, and you can make those via handshake. Any questions? Does anybody have any questions, or should I keep going?
There is one in the chat.
Okay, I see now. I didn't see it pop up at first. So one of the questions that we have from the chat are, what are strong questions that impress recruiters at the end of an interview? That's an excellent question. So what questions should you ask your interviewer at the end?
The fact that you will ask questions is going to be impressive, because a lot of people don't. And I think a lot of people just assume that it maybe is polite to say, actually, I think I'm good, thank you. But instead of thinking that's polite, it really comes across as not prepared. So the fact that you have any questions is going to be good. We usually say try to avoid bringing up salary and benefits. So as long as you're not saying something like, well, what salary do you have in mind for this position? Because a lot of time, really kind of what you're supposed to do is sort of kind of feels like a game, that you want them to bring up the salary, you want them to name the salary first, the number. So as long as you're staying away from that, at least on an initial interview, I think any questions are fair game, and really kind of think about it in terms less of trying to impress them and more of realizing this is a two-way thing, that you are also interviewing them. and you need to be able to have some questions that's going to help you make a decision in the event that you're offered the position and the different position. Like, how are you going to sort of figure out, well, which one, what would you, okay, so here's some examples that I think are helpful is if you can ask somebody to maybe describe the atmosphere of the office. What's the environment like? What's their favorite part of working at that organization? Because then you'll get different people answer in different ways, and that gives you good insight. So at that point, I think as long as you can stay away from sort of the taboo at this point questions of benefits and salary, think about questions that you truly want to know. The other caveat to that is as long as it's not blasted everywhere on their website. So you don't want to ask a question that is like, well, what do you guys do? You know, and they're going to be like, you should know this by now. Or you don't want to ask, how big is your staff when their directory is online? You know, do a little research ahead of time. And then when you ask questions, it really even kind of comes across, like Amy was saying, that tells them a lot about you. You can ask deeper, more insightful questions that shows them, oh, you must really be interested if you need to ask about something that's going on that we just posted about on Twitter, or our new product or something like that. So it's kind of like, it will be impressive most likely if it avoids those two things. And then also it helps you. So you're thinking about it from your benefit.
I totally agree. You said that nearly perfectly. I think the only thing that I would add would be, and simply because I get a lot of questions about this in my office, if you want to know about the timeline for hiring, that's something that you should ask. Don't expect them to volunteer that information, although many do. So, you know, what's the next step in this process, or what does the timeline look like in terms of when I should hear back something. I say that because I have too many students who don't know when to follow up and how to follow up because it was just a question that never got asked. So anything that's pressing, as long as it doesn't, like Tiffany said, deal with pay or benefits, that would ease your mind in knowing that timeline, feel free to ask it.
I think those are great tips for questions. I tell the students as well, sort of off of what Tiffany was saying, is you're interviewing them as well as them interviewing you. So asking about atmosphere, or asking what's a typical day like for a employee that has this position. So you can sort of see sort of what the daily expectations or the daily tasks are. But having, and also reiterate what Amy said, having 2 or 3 questions at least written down ahead of time. They may answer your questions during the course of the interview process, but they may not. So you want to, so you don't forget that, you know, you take a padfolio, a nice padfolio with you, where you're maybe taking some notes of things they say, but then you have written down the questions because you will get nervous, and you may, when they say, do you have any questions for us? You may say, oh, okay. No thanks, like Tiffany said, because you may get nervous and forget. So if you have them written down, that's a great tip. Do we have any more questions from participants before I ask the questions? And thanks to Sydney for asking that question. That was a good one to start with. I'll ask a next one and then see if then continue to see if anybody wants to chime in. So what should a candidate do if their computer freezes, if they get disconnected, if something goes wrong, technical? That's very specific to virtual interviews. What should a candidate do in that situation?
Okay, I feel like I have all the experience with this right at this point, but except for usually I'm on the interviewer end. I really like to start my meeting with what to do in the case of a technology issue. You know, hey, how are you? Let's cover some baseline stuff. If we get disconnected, hang out on the line and we'll come right back to where we are. I do that sort of as the person directing the interview, but I think it's totally fine if you want to ask that. So if you get contacted to do a virtual interview, and in your questions before your interview about the logistics, if you want to say, how will it work and what happens if I get disconnected? What's your suggestion? I think that's something we all have to think of now. But that is certainly something that you can ask, I think, right off the bat, just to communicate. Like I said, I've had to switch modes. And the thing that I like about the new version of Zoom is that it tries immediately to reconnect you once it boots you off. I don't know if Skype does that, but to set a baseline is never a bad idea, so that you're not just freaking out and wondering what you should do.
I agree. That's good. I always think too, like when I go to do a presentation in a classroom and I expect to have internet or PowerPoint and I don't, and I'm glad that I have a printout. I guess kind of thinking like that, like just make sure you have a phone number to call.
Yeah.
Or, worst case scenario, if you try to get reconnected and it's just not working, can you at least do a telephone interview? Or at least call them and say, hey, this is not going to work out. It doesn't look like, can we try this again tomorrow? Or whatever your options are, but just have a different way to reach them. And also you have email. So I've been communicating with people. Sometimes we're trying to do the Zoom and something's not going right, and so we're emailing too. So just some other way to reach the person besides just that link, I guess, which typically you will have because that's how you set it up. But just to have that prepared and know to go ahead and reach out. I think the sooner you can do that, the better, to explain what's going on.
Those are great advice, and feel comfortable asking that ahead of time is good, because we're going to, we're nervous about. That happened to me actually yesterday. I was doing a mock interview with a student, and for some reason the sound didn't work. And so in the chat, I asked her for her phone number. And so we kept the visual, and then I called her on the phone. So having that backup way to do that. I see a question has come through on the chat. So Amy and Tiffany, would you suggest sending a follow-up thank you for a virtual interview? If so, what's the best way to send that thank you?
Yeah, good question. I think definitely you would want to send a follow-up thank you, because again, you're just kind of trying to pretend like it's a normal interview. So that's what you would typically do. The fact that you will do it again will be impressive, because so many people forget that step. And because of that, really, I guess what I would do is probably send it through an email, especially right now. I mean, you could do a handwritten note, you could do a typed out letter. People have different opinions on what's best to do. But I think especially, I mean, if we're doing a Zoom interview, probably it's because they're not going into the office. I don't know. I mean, I just think the email is probably it's going to be quicker. It's going to be more accessible. And I think, again, it's more important that you do it versus in which way did you do it? Like, kind of what was your medium? So I think that's probably what I would do. It might depend on the situation, and we can talk through that with you. But I would definitely do an email. I mean, do a thank you note. And then sometimes people will add, well, I could let Amy take this. Let me hush for a little while. Let her.
Okay. Yeah, no, go ahead if you want to, Tiffany.
I was going to say, sometimes people will ask, who do I send it to? Is it just one email, or is it to everybody that's on? So let's say you do have an interview that's got 15 people interviewing you or sitting, listening in. I would say if you happen to have everybody's email ahead of time, it wouldn't hurt to send it to everybody, but a lot of times you'll have maybe one or two contacts. And you can do that, and you can even say in your thank you note, please share with the rest of the staff that I appreciate them attending my interview, and I enjoyed meeting them. Or if you only have maybe 2 or 3 people interviewing you on the Zoom call and you have those emails, maybe that then would be a little, easier to do an individual thank you note to each one. And again, like, all these little nuances are not as important as they feel, like it's not as, not going to make it or break it. I think the biggest thing is that you do it, that you send one, and that it be pretty soon afterwards. Like we say, about 24 hours is your time frame.
Amy, did you have anything?
Totally agree.
And I would just add to that the Career Center website has sample thank you letters on. So if you go to career.ua.edu, and under development tab, it shows you how to develop resumes, cover letters, but there's a sample thank you letter. So if you're wondering, well, what should I say in a thank you letter? You can make an appointment with one of us. We're happy to help you form that, but also there's samples on our website for that type of thing. So thank you for that question. Does anybody else want to ask a question? Anybody brave enough to ask one themselves, unmute themselves and ask a question? Nobody? Okay, well, I'll ask. I have a couple more in line here that I'll ask so we can share some more tips, and then continue to put questions in the chat or speak up if you have one. So what are some common questions? We are in a special time right now, being in quarantine or social distancing. So what are some questions that that may come up in the interview related to COVID, you know, based on, you know, our semester ended early in person, you know, summer is kind of different. We didn't have an in-person graduation. So what are some questions that an interviewer might ask related to COVID-19?
Yeah, so I think you kind of want to be prepared to discuss what you've been doing. We've all been kind of at home, a lot of us, and I think it's important that, I mean, you're all here because you want some skills development. You wanted to get better at virtual interviewing or learn more about that. So if you're not keeping sort of up with that, start writing it down and start reflecting on the things that you're doing, because I think you could be prepared for an answer about, you know, what have you been involved with, especially if you had like a canceled or rescinded offer or something like that. You want to have that. Some of the other things that you maybe asked might be closer to sort of logistics question, like, you know, once we move to a physical environment, can you do this work from home, or can you do this, you know, on site? So things related to how you will accomplish this job both at home and when we move back into our offices and things like that. Anything you'd have to add, Tiffany?
I don't think so about that. I know before our Zoom started, when we were, you know, emailing back and forth about if, and Paige, you may be about to ask this question, so maybe jumping ahead, but let's just say that you get an interview invite and they want you to come do an in-person interview and you don't feel ready yet or comfortable with that. Mm-hmm. Is it okay to ask that? And I think Amy in our emails made a good point that really you should be able to ask that without even saying that you're uncomfortable. You should be able to say, well, is it possible to do an in-person interview? A Zoom interview instead of in person. And you could say something like, given the circumstances of what's going on. And then, yeah, I feel like, so we're trying to be experts, but nobody's really an expert on COVID. So we can just talk about this if anybody has other thoughts that come to mind. But I think if they are insistent that you come in, then I think it's appropriate that you just ask what are the procedures that they're doing for being in the office. Like, are people wearing masks? Because I would much rather do a Zoom interview than sit in front of you and wear a mask to interview in. I just think that's even more awkward. But I think you could ask different things like that because you do want to make sure they're taking precautions. Yeah, I think it's just odd. And I think, well, one thing is that everybody's kind of in it together in terms of like, this is new and it's kind of going to be awkward for everybody. So I don't think it's going to come across like, how dare you ask us that? You know, I think you can do that in a way that's not going to hurt you. The only thing I can think of is if they insist on it being in person and you just, no matter what they say about it, you don't feel comfortable with it, there is a risk, like if you decline the interview, you know, and you would just know that you're taking that risk if you are willing to kind of, I don't know, you're kind of having to weigh the pros and cons of that and what it means, but that's tough.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're well within your right to ask, you know, well, a great question for any company would be, you know, what has been your response to COVID and how have you adapted and adjusted? And I think they would share a lot of things that would be very revealing about how they would treat their employees and how they would, either protect, hopefully, or not, their health and safety and well-being. And then as that way you wouldn't be going, I'm wondering about what I do when I get sick. How much is the sick leave? You're not supposed to ask questions necessarily about benefits. We always discourage that. So hopefully that would cover some of the things that are new to our current situation without you having to outright say, those things. And then I think also if you want, like Tiffany said, if you want to ask, what are the procedures for coming in person? I do that when I got my hair cut and I called and said, do I come in or do I sit in my car and someone will come out to me? So I think we're all getting used to that. And I don't think it's it's not a far stretch to ask your employer, potential employer, those things. And like you were saying in the end, it really is up to you, depending on your risk factors and then the perceived risk of the situation, what you would like to do then.
Those are great tips. I just wanted to add to, we had a session earlier in these career champion chats earlier this week about developing skills during this time, during COVID quarantine time. But I just wanted to add there that there's some things that, Google has some free internet certificates you can get. LinkedIn has some things. So if you are finding that, you've graduated or you're between, classes and things and you do want to fill your time, then there are some things that you can do. And again, you can follow up with somebody at the Career Center, make an appointment. We can talk through with you specifically, what your major is, what your skills are, and point you into the direction of some of those opportunities for you. And we did have a question come in on the chat. So Abigail would like to know what you should do if you're unsure how to answer a question during an interview.
Yeah.
Do you want to start?
You can go ahead.
Okay. So I have a little first internal in my head tip that I use, like a psychological trick for questions that I don't feel that I can answer. Take time to think about it first. I think a lot of people think that silence is bad in an interview, and you certainly don't want to be silent for several minutes, but it never feels as long to the interviewer as it does to you, the interviewee. So it's okay if you want to take time, even if you want to repeat the question out loud so that you can process through that. My little mental trick that I use is rephrase it in your head in your words. So if they ask, tell me about a time that you failed at something, and that freaks you out. The word failure, is something that we don't love to use. Think, what else could failure be? Well, disappointment, mistake, something like that, and then answer in the way that it makes you feel comfortable and in the way that you would speak about something that was imperfect for you. I'll let you go, Tiffany.
I do a similar thing. That's good advice to rephrase it and think about that. And I think it's basically the same thing, is that you try to get close. You try to think of like the spirit of the question. So even if you can't think, oh gosh, when have I failed? If you're like, I've never failed a class before, what am I going to say? And you just focus on, you're fixated on that word. Mm-hmm. But if you think, okay, they really are wanting to know. And that's where, like Amy said, if you could take a second, you just take a few seconds to really think, what are they looking for? And you could say, and think scale too. I think that particular type of question, like you think, fail a class, but I mean, you could have failed at your next project you didn't get started on as soon as you wanted to, or you didn't have the outcome in a lab experiment or something that you wanted. So I think when you're trying to think about, well, I don't know if I can answer about failure, but I will tell you about a challenge that I encountered recently. Now, you don't want to just get into a habit of taking their question and being like, let me ask a better question or answer a better question. But if you just truly are stumped on something, you're like, goodness, I'm not sure if I could think of a time that I have failed. Then if you can just keep talking, and instead of saying, I'm sorry, I don't have anything for that, if you could say, I'm having a really hard time thinking of an answer to that particular question, I can share with you that a time I had a challenge that I overcame was this. Usually, if it's in that kind of realm, that will satisfy them. Another idea is if you just don't understand what they're asking you. Like, instead of just, you can't think of anything, if you're like, I'm not 100% sure that I am clear on your question here, then I think it's totally fine for you to ask them, can you explain what you mean by that question? Probably won't do that one time though. You probably don't want to, like, if you're still stumped, be like, can you rephrase it in a different way? Like, you probably need to do that one time and then just go with your other, rephrasing it in your head or whatever you have to do there. But the biggest thing is, if you practice, you'll have fewer instances of that happening, and you'll come up with these stories. Like, you review your resume, and if you can remember different situations and stories from your experiences, then maybe you do have a hard time thinking of something for a particular question, or maybe you've prepared a type of answer in case they ask you about leadership, but they ask you about initiative. And so you just take that question or that answer that you've prepared and you just sort of adapt it. So I think the biggest thing is being prepared and remembering things, and then you can kind of use them for different types of questions. But yeah, practice is definitely going to be the best kind of antidote to that.
I think that both of you gave excellent tips on that. I tell people it's okay to take a deep breath, because Amy said silence, we think it's like this long silence. But if you think of in terms of taking a deep breath, that's not a very long silence. Like, it might feel like a long time to you, but it's not very long. So then that might give you the minute to think of the alternative answer, or, a different way to word it than what they asked for. So we did get another question in the chat. Erica wants to know, for interviews that are specifically for academic reasons, can we use COVID-19 for speaking about an obstacle? So I guess if they're asking you an obstacle you've overcome. And Erica, maybe you're talking about interviews for getting into graduate school, or interviews for getting, like, I know, like, nursing program, you have to do interviews to get into the upper division of nursing, upper division of athletic training, different programs. So Amy and Tiffany, do you have any advice on whether we should use overcoming this space and time would be a good reason?
I think it's completely on the table. It's been a challenge for everybody. It's been tough. I would probably, just going through it in my head, as long as you can talk about it, depends on how deep a challenge it is, as long as you can talk about it without getting emotional, then I think it's a good idea. Emotions are not bad, but you don't want to lose your composure and then really struggle for the rest of the interview. But I definitely think that this has been an opportunity for us to grow and learn certainly new skills and learn who we are under a lot of difficulty and pressure.
Good point. I think on the other end of that is, if you share about COVID being an obstacle, you just don't want it to be too general that it sounds like anybody could say this. You don't want to say, yeah, it was really tough when we had to do school online. And, if it's something that just applies to everybody and there's nothing unique to you, it may not be your best answer. It's not that it's going to be a lie or it's going to be a bad answer. It just, you may have a better answer that gets a little bit more specific to you and they can picture it better. And Erica, feel free to clarify if we're missing the mark on what you mean by that. But
yeah, I think what I was thinking between what, I'm sorry, Tiffany, I talked over you. Okay. Between Tiffany and what Amy was saying, like, if you or a family member, became ill with COVID and it was very emotional for you, then, that might not be something you're able to talk about and keep your composure. But if it was something like, more specific, like Tiffany was saying, your internship got canceled or cut short because of COVID, and so then you didn't get all the experience that you wanted to get. So that became an obstacle, and then how did you overcome it? You got a new internship, or you were able to do some work virtually, or you took an extra course. So those are ways that you can talk about, that may not be as emotional, but it created an obstacle for you. And then how did you work to overcome that obstacle? And so, yes, like Tiffany said, Erica, if we didn't answer your question, feel free to elaborate on that, or tell us to answer it correctly. Anybody want to ask? Anybody want to unmute themselves and ask? I should have maybe done some questions of the students so that they could talk and it wasn't just us talking. Oh, Erica says thank you. Thank you, Tiffany and Amy, for the question. Let me see what time we have. We still have a few more minutes. So let me see what you would, so Amy and Tiffany, do you have, recommendations for how you might anticipate what, because we've talked about practicing, doing mock interviews and practicing. Do you have some tips for how you might anticipate what kinds of questions you might get asked?
Like we talked about earlier with just looking at what questions are possibilities. Now, you will never be able to anticipate every possible question. I mean, and if you've ever been in any sort of interview, they can be very different. It depends on the style of the interviewer. Sometimes they're very straightforward and typical HR questions. Sometimes it just feels more like a conversation. Mm-hmm. Personally, I would rather prepare for the getting grilled and then it's a conversation and then assuming it's going to be just a chat, and then it's like, give me an example of everything you've ever done. So I think knowing some of the typical types of interview questions is helpful. And I think the other thing, like what I usually tell students, is to sit down and look at your resume and take it like section by section and job by job. So let's say that you had 3 years ago, you were a lifeguard at a pool, and that's on your resume. It is fair game for them to ask you questions about it, and it is fair game for you to use examples from it. But if it was 3 years ago, it is also very understandable that you would have forgotten a lot of stuff about it, specific details. But if they're going to be asking you questions, and we haven't really talked about the STAR interview method. If anybody has questions about what that is, it's on our website and you can find it lots of places, but it's an acronym. It stands for situation, task, action, and result. It's kind of a guide for how to tell a complete story, basically, is what that is. And it's really hard to tell a complete story without details. So that's like when you're reviewing your resume and you see that lifeguard position, and I tell people to kind of think about, okay, in that role in particular, when was this time that you can remember that you showed leadership? When was a challenge? What was a challenge that you had as a lifeguard that summer that you overcame? And you're just kind of digging deeper into that particular role so that those memories surface, and then you're able to kind of, let me use that example for this question. And and you do that throughout your resume. To me, getting really familiar with your resume and just recalling different stories and experiences that you've had is some of the best prep that you can give yourself. And then once you've done that, if you can also kind of then move through some of those typical questions, like give me an example of a time that you had to work with, you had a difficult person to work with. And normally that would be like, oh gosh, that's tricky, that I don't know. But then if you've recalled a lot of stuff, and you can maneuver that question a little bit better once you kind of refresh what your memory is on those different experiences.
The only thing that I would add would be find that job description, print it out, and go through. Not all job descriptions have a set of competencies that they're going to put forth. Some are kind of more general. Some have something that pretty much everybody can do, like communication and stuff. Well, communication is pretty specific. But, things like that, some are more general. And diagram that job description for anything that you see that you think, oh, there could be an interview question related to communication across, cultural barriers or whatever the competency that they had there. And that's one way to anticipate what they are looking for, is they will have put it out there for you on the job description. Number two, and this is something that I do a lot, I have a friend and her name is Google. And I'll Google, if you're going to be a social media manager, I will Google competencies, social media manager, to see, what's out there in terms of the literature of what HR is going to be looking for you to meet these core minimum competencies if you're going to do this job. One of them might be search engine optimization. Another, there may be others that you will want to think of an example like Tiffany was saying and directly speak to a time you did it or a time you took a class or had a project in it. So your best friend Google and then the job description will be a huge help. Because what we do, I know like at UA, our HR department has a great tab on their website where you can just pull up a set of competencies, decide that it's important to you and in the job that you're hiring for, and you can pull down interview questions exactly related to that. So they probably have a system like that, at the company that you're applying to and interviewing with as well. So that's a little bit of studying and due diligence you can do to find that out.
Great answers. We have another question that came in on the chat. Ariana wants to know, what's the best way to answer the question when they say, tell us a little bit about yourself?
Good question. That's kind of difficult to answer. It shouldn't be, but for some reason it's hard for me to explain that because, and I'm going to point you to some things that we have in our career guide, which is also on our website. If you go to career.ua.edu, you can see a lot of information there. A lot of the information is on the actual website, but there is under resources a career guide that you could see if you want to look at that. But there's different ways to kind of go about this. You can, again, we mentioned earlier the elevator pitch or the elevator speech, they'll sometimes call it. And you can kind of get it a little bit kind of to where you can fill in blanks. Like you can talk about hi, my name is Tiffany Gooden. I'm a freshman at the University of Alabama. I'm majoring in communication. And it kind of is like a summary of your resume. It may change a little bit depending on what you're applying for. So you want to kind of explain and talk about the stuff that's most relevant to the job that you're there for. Another idea is that they're probably, if you don't include it in your answer to tell me about yourself, the next question is going to be, why are you interested in this position? And so sometimes it's helpful to be able to kind of tie that together. I'm majoring in communication, and the reason I was interested in this position is because I had an internship over the summer that led me to, being interested in this particular position on campus. And so you can kind of tie some of that in. Amy, I'm gonna let you jump in on that if you have any other more concrete.
Yep, that is the formula. The thing that I tell people too is elevator pitches and tell me about yourself. If you lay it out and you make sure that you have strategically placed the most relevant things that you've done, then my hope in an interview is that sets the scaffold and the structure for a lot of what they're going to ask you about. So then they might say, oh, well, tell me about the time that you worked with the refugees, that you volunteered and worked with refugees and things that you laid out for them. Then hopefully they take that bait and you can drive the interview to some extent. The other thing that I often tell people, and this is hard, so take some time to think about this, is do you want to have something that feels pretty memorable in there while still being relevant? So I'll give you an example. I still remember this to this day. I used to work with human environmental sciences, and I was working with a fashion retailing student who told me a story about her hometown of Slap Out, Alabama, which is a real place. She told me about the name Slap Out and how it came from an expression that somebody was slapped out of something, totally out of an item. And she said, so from the time that I was born in Slap Out, Alabama, I knew that I needed to be in fashion retail so that no one would ever be slap out of anything in, whatever she was interviewing for. I laughed. I don't remember her name, but I would call her back just to hear more. And so that was seemingly irrelevant little piece of information that she was able to fold back into what she wanted to do and how she wanted to do that. So if you can think of something interesting that would be, that would recall you to their memory, then that's something that I think is a neat little addition to like your basic elevator pitch.
Right.
Great. I want to add just a quick thing to that, and then we have a few minutes left. I tell people to practice your elevator pitch, or we say elevator pitch, but that's basically to tell me about yourself. Probably a minute and a half is about how long you want, because you want to, what Tiffany's saying, sort of summarize some of the main points maybe of your experience or on your resume, but you don't want to tell them your whole resume, because they've got it and they're going to be asking you questions. So it's sort of an initial thing too, like Amy was saying, to sort of get their attention. You may have some interesting facts about yourself or where you're from, but practicing it is really important, so that, because I have had people in mock interviews when I say, tell me about yourselves, and then they just kind of look like a deer in headlights. So practicing it is really important. We have about 4 minutes left. So, if anybody has any questions, I would love for somebody to ask a verbal question. I think maybe I didn't set it up as well to get the participants involved as I could have. But if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself, or if you have any other questions, put them in the chat. While we're seeing if anybody has any last minute questions, Amy or Tiffany, do you have some last minute tips that you can think of for acing a virtual interview, or even, an in-person interview?
I would just say, you know us now, you've seen us, and we're not that scary, I don't think. So we'd love to practice with you. I think we said that in almost every answer. Practice it, say it out loud, that kind of thing. And I think Paige put in the website so you can find how to request an appointment there to practice and mock interview. We can do it specific to a position if you want to bring a job posting, and we'll look through it. And we can do stuff that is more general, just for practice. And like Paige said, just general tips as well.
And, Tiffany, do you have any last tips about interviewing?
I know one thing that is sometimes hard to do is, especially if you're new to interviewing and it's awkward being on Zoom, is to smile in your interview, which sounds like such a small little tip, but it's kind of like with the eye contact. It just makes it feel more like you're in person. And sometimes even in person, it's hard if you're new to interviewing, if you're nervous, you don't feel super jovial, so it can be hard to smile as you're interacting. And I've had students before where we've really had to practice that. I mean, because you want to smile, but you don't want to look fake. You don't want to just, fake smile throughout it where it looks very obvious that you're trying to smile. But I think, again, practicing that and just kind of being aware of that's a nonverbal behavior that is a pretty big deal. So not to just add more things to be nervous about, but just there's so much to think about. I know we keep saying practice. It is truly, really the only way to get to really feel like you're doing a good job preparing is to practice, because sometimes it is all clicking and you're doing everything right in your mind, and then it comes to the actual practice of it and it's like totally different. That's like, it feels different in a suit, and it feels different when you're actually trying to smile and convey information and put everything in the words. So since it's such a big, all-encompassing kind of a thing, I think the practice is really going to benefit you. And we can do that so many different ways. Again, like Paige said earlier, even if it's just talking to us about interviewing, sometimes it's more comfortable even before the mock interview for students to just say, hey, here's what I'm thinking about saying. If they ask me this question, or if they ask me, tell me about yourself, is this right? And so just to be able to talk that through with somebody is really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to sort of wrap up here. Tiffany and Amy are great experts on these issues. You can see some other faces from the Career Center that are on as well. Linda Johnson, Sherry Tilley, Susan Coles, Mary Lowry. All of us are available, whether virtually right now, but hopefully in person, sooner rather than later. But we are available to help you with any aspects of career development and job search, or, previous to that, developing skills. So we'd love for you to visit the website And Mary has pointed out in the chat, under the resources tab of the Career Center website, you'll see a virtual interview practice platform called Interview Stream. So you can even do a sort of virtual practice if you're nervous to practice in front of a person. You can try Interview Stream. So I know that we're out of time, but please visit us at career.ua.edu to make an appointment if you have more questions. And thank you so much for attending today. We really appreciate it. And we're hoping to offer some more virtual sessions in the future so that you can take advantage of it while we are away from each other. So thank you very much, and roll